On November 7, 1991, Irvin "Magic" Johnson walked into a press conference in Inglewood, California, and said 5 words that stopped the world. "I have the HIV virus." He was 32 years old, the greatest point guard in basketball history, a man who had never walked into a room without filling it. And in one sentence, under fluorescent lights with the whole country watching, everything he had built, the championships, the crowd, the life, seemed to collapse into a single terrifying silence. What made that moment so devastating was not just the diagnosis. It was the contrast. Magic Johnson had spent his entire career being the exception to every rule. Too tall to play point guard, too joyful to survive professional sports, too visible to stay grounded. He had defied every limitation placed on him. And now, at the height of his power, a virus too small to see had done what no defender, no rival, no setback ever could. He retired that day. The basketball was over. But here is what the headline never told you. The retirement was not the tragedy. The 30 years that followed, the fear, the scrutiny, the personal losses, the medical war fought quietly inside his own body, and the price his family paid for the symbol the world needed him to be. That is the story most people never heard. At 66, Irvin Johnson is still standing, still smiling, still filling every room he enters. But behind that smile is a man who has buried versions of himself more times than most people could survive. A man who watched his marriage almost fracture under the weight of a diagnosis he gave himself. Who watched his son face a different kind of public judgment, who carried H.I.V in his body for over 3 decades, while the world debated whether he deserved sympathy or condemnation. This is not a story about basketball. It is a story about what happens after the final buzzer. When the crowd goes home, the cameras turn off, and a man is left alone with the truth of what his life actually cost. Irvin Johnson Jr. was born on August 14, 1959, in Lansing, Michigan, a working-class city built around the auto industry where most families lived by the rhythm of the General Motors plant shifts. His father, Irvin Sr., worked 2 jobs without complaint: days on the factory floor, nights cleaning offices. His mother, Christine, served food in a school cafeteria and raised 10 children with a discipline that left no room for self-pity. There was never enough money. There was always enough structure. Magic would later say that growing up in that house taught him one thing above all else: you do not wait for someone to hand you a life. You build one. It was a lesson he absorbed early, and one he never forgot. Even decades later, when the world tried to take everything he had built away from him. He found basketball the way most kids in Lansing found it: by accident, then by obsession. By his early teens, he was spending every available hour at the Main Street courts, staying until the lights went off, then going home and lying awake thinking about the game. He was already 6'5" at 15, with the handles of a guard, and the vision of someone who seemed to see the play 3 seconds before it happened. It was a local sports writer, Fred Stabley Jr., who gave him the nickname after watching him put up 36 points, 16 rebounds, and 16 assists in a high school game. "I'm going to call you Magic," Stabley told him. The name fit so perfectly that within weeks, nobody in Lansing called him anything else. At Michigan State, Magic Johnson did not just play basketball, he changed it. Under coach Judd Heathcote, he brought a style of play that was almost offensive in its joy. No-look passes, full-court runs, fast breaks that looked choreographed. But it was the 1979 NCAA championship game that announced him to the country. The opponent was Indiana State, led by a forward named Larry Bird. 35 million people watched. The highest-rated college basketball game in history. A number that still stands. Magic scored 24 points, grabbed 7 rebounds, and handed out 5 assists. Michigan State won. And the two players who would define the next decade of professional basketball had met for the first time. He was 19 years old. The Los Angeles Lakers drafted him first overall that summer. He arrived in Hollywood with no hesitation and no adjustment period. From his first training camp, teammates noticed that Magic Johnson played every possession as though he personally owed the crowd something. He pushed pace in an era of slow-down basketball. He smiled at opponents. He hugged referees. He made Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, a man famously guarded and private, laugh on the court. What followed became known as Showtime. 5 NBA championships between 1980 and 1988. 3 league MVP awards, 12 All-Star selections, a partnership with Kareem that remains the most effective player combination in Lakers history. Magic ran the fast break with the precision of a conductor. Every pass timed, every angle calculated, but made it look effortless enough that casual fans thought he was just improvising. The 1980 finals defined his legend before it had barely begun. Game 6. Kareem injured and unable to play. Magic, a 20-year-old rookie, started at center against the Philadelphia 76ers. He finished with 42 points, 15 rebounds, and 7 assists. The Lakers won the championship. Magic Johnson was named Finals MVP, the only rookie in history to receive the award. But the rivalry that gave the entire era its meaning was not against Philadelphia. It was against Boston and against Larry Bird. Bird and Magic had been linked since that 1979 final. Their careers ran parallel, both drafted the same year, both entering the league together, both immediately transforming their franchises. Bird's Celtics and Magic's Lakers met 3 times in the NBA Finals during the 1980s. They pushed each other to a standard the league had not seen before and has rarely seen since. Off the court, they barely knew each other. On it, they were everything the other needed to become better. Magic later admitted that Bird was the first opponent who genuinely frightened him. Not physically, psychologically. He made me feel like I had to earn every single thing, he said. Every game. Every possession. He never gave me anything. That edge, the refusal to be comfortable, the constant internal demand, ran through everything Magic did. By the late 1980s, he was not just the most recognizable basketball player on the planet. He was the face of a franchise, a city, and an era. He had money, fame, championships, and a reputation so clean that his name became shorthand for something rare. A superstar who was also genuinely liked. He married his college sweetheart, Cookie Kelly, in September of 1991. They had dated on and off for a decade. She was pregnant with their first child together. Magic was 32 years old, healthy, at the peak of his career, and for the first time in his life, completely settled. 53 days later, he sat down in front of a microphone and told the world he had H.I.V. Magic Johnson did not find out on the court. He found out in a doctor's office during a routine physical required for a life insurance application. The test came back positive for H.I.V. He was told quietly, in a room with no cameras, no crowd, no teammate to look at. Just a result on a piece of paper, and a disease that, in 1991, most people still understood primarily as a death sentence. His first thought, he later said, was not about himself. It was about Cookie. They had been married for 53 days. She was pregnant. And Magic knew, sitting in that office, that there was a real possibility he had infected his wife and his unborn child. That knowledge, before the press conference, before the retirement announcement, before any of the public drama, was the first and deepest wound. Everything else that followed was secondary to those hours of not knowing whether Cookie and the baby were safe. Cookie tested negative. Their son, Irvin Johnson III, EJ, was born healthy in June of 1992. But the relief of those results arrived weeks after the diagnosis. And the weeks in between were, by Magic's own account, the closest he ever came to a complete psychological collapse. He had faced pressure his entire career. He had never faced fear like that. The press conference on November 7, 1991, has been replayed thousands of times. What gets lost in the replays is the specificity of that cultural moment. This was not 2025, with decades of HIV education and effective medication behind it. This was 1991. The AIDS crisis had been killing people for a decade. The disease was still widely understood as a punishment for homosexuality, for drug use, for moral failure of some kind. When Magic Johnson announced he had HIV, through heterosexual transmission, a significant portion of the public did not respond with sympathy. They responded with suspicion. Tabloids questioned the transmission route. Radio hosts made jokes. Letters arrived at the Lakers' offices, not all of them supportive. And within the NBA itself, the reaction among some players was something Magic had never experienced in a locker room: fear of physical contact. Karl Malone of the Utah Jazz, one of the most respected players in the league, wrote an op-ed stating his concerns about playing against an HIV-positive player. He was not alone in his hesitation. The science was clear. HIV cannot be transmitted through ordinary athletic contact. But in 1991, the science had not yet caught up with the fear. Magic understood it intellectually. Emotionally, it was a different matter. These were men he had competed alongside for years. The distance some of them placed between themselves and him in those weeks landed differently than any defensive scheme ever had. He retired on the day of the announcement. He had no choice. His insurers required it. The league's medical protocols at the time left little room for an HIV-positive player, and the public pressure was immediate. At 32 years old, at the absolute peak of his physical ability, one of the greatest basketball players in history walked away from the game involuntarily. He did not fade out. He did not retire on his own terms after a farewell season. He was removed by a virus before he was ready. The grief of that loss was real, and Magic has spoken about it with unusual candor. "I was angry," he admitted in a 2012 interview. "I didn't show it publicly because I felt like I had to be strong. But inside, I was furious. I wasn't done. I had more to give, and that was just gone." Within weeks of the announcement, something unexpected happened. Letters arrived by the thousands. Not hate mail, but the opposite. Men and women, teenagers, people in hospitals, people in rural towns who had been hiding their diagnoses for years, writing to Magic Johnson because seeing him stand at that microphone with his composure intact had done something for them that nothing else had. He had not asked for the role. He had not trained for it. But overnight, Irvin Johnson became the most visible HIV-positive person in the world. And the world expected him to carry that visibility with grace, with optimism, with the same wide smile he had always brought to the court. The pressure to perform hope, even when he was terrified, became its own kind of exhaustion. He founded the Magic Johnson Foundation in 1991, within weeks of the diagnosis. The initial goal was HIV and AIDS education and prevention. The work was genuine, and it reached communities, particularly Black communities, that the mainstream AIDS conversation had consistently ignored. But it also locked him into a public role that allowed very little room for the private truth of what he was experiencing. He could not have a bad day publicly. He could not express doubt. Every interview required him to project survivability, because millions of people with HIV were watching him to calibrate their own hope. It was a burden he accepted, and one that quietly cost him. In 1992, the United States Olympic Committee selected him for the Dream Team, the first Olympic basketball roster composed entirely of NBA players. It should have been a pure celebration. Instead, it arrived wrapped in controversy. Several international players expressed concern about competing against him. The debate, again, centered on science that was already settled. But fear rarely operates on settled science. Magic played anyway. He played brilliantly, averaging 8 points and 5.5 assists per game, visibly joyful on the court in a way that seemed almost defiant. The United States won gold in Barcelona, and for those 2 weeks, for the first time since the diagnosis, Magic Johnson looked like himself again. He attempted to return to the Lakers in 1992. The comeback lasted 1 preseason before he retired again. This time, in part, because the discomfort among players had not fully resolved, and because the public and media attention around every practice, every game, every physical moment with other players had become unmanageable. He tried again in 1996, playing 32 regular season games before retiring for the final time at 36. The basketball career ended not with a single dramatic moment, but in pieces, taken apart slowly over 5 years by circumstances he had not chosen and could not control. What Magic Johnson did next is the part of the story that his basketball legacy tends to overshadow. And it is, in many ways, the more remarkable achievement. Beginning in the mid-1990s, he began building a business empire with the same systematic intelligence he had applied to basketball. But the strategy was not simply about accumulating wealth, it was deliberate and specific. He targeted underserved urban communities, predominantly Black neighborhoods that major corporations had written off as unprofitable, and built infrastructure there. He opened Starbucks locations in Harlem, Compton, and inner-city Atlanta, when the company had no presence in those markets. He brought AMC movie theaters into communities where the nearest multiplex was 40 minutes away. He partnered with TGI, Fridays, 24-Hour Fitness, and eventually became part of the ownership group that purchased the Los Angeles Dodgers in 2012 for $2 billion, the largest transaction in sports history at the time. Magic Johnson Enterprises grew into a company valued at over $1 billion. He hired from the communities he served. He reinvested locally, and he did it without the narrative framework of charity. He structured it as business, because he understood instinctively that a community that was only the recipient of charity remained dependent, while a community that was the customer of a profitable enterprise became valued. It was the most concrete answer he could give to the years of being told, explicitly and implicitly, that his presence was a liability. But the business success, as real as it was, did not resolve the personal costs accumulating in the background. Cookie Johnson has rarely received the full weight of credit she deserves in this story. When Magic's diagnosis became public, she was 53 days into a marriage, pregnant with her first child, and facing the knowledge that her husband, who had been unfaithful during their relationship, had exposed her to HIV. She stayed. That decision is often treated as a footnote, a detail of spousal loyalty wrapped up in a single sentence. It was not a footnote. It was the load-bearing decision of their life together, made under conditions most marriages would not survive. Cookie has said publicly that the months after the diagnosis were the hardest of her life, not because of fear for herself, but because of the sustained emotional work required to rebuild trust with a man she loved, while simultaneously being photographed and scrutinized every time she stood beside him. They rebuilt their marriage. It required years, not months. Magic has been unambiguous about the fact that he would not still be standing today, in any sense, without her. "Cookie saved me," he has said, more than once. "Not just emotionally. She gave me a reason to fight the virus. She gave me something to stay alive for." Their son, E.J., grew up in a household shaped by extraordinary circumstances. He was born to parents managing a chronic illness, a public crisis, and a marriage under reconstruction. He attended school under a name that made him immediately identifiable. He had no version of a normal childhood, not because his parents failed him, but because the world that surrounded his family made ordinary anonymity impossible. When E.J. came out publicly as gay in 2013, the reaction was complex. Magic Johnson's public support was immediate and unequivocal. He stood beside his son at events. He spoke about love and acceptance in interviews, and the response from much of the public was positive. A former NBA star of his generation actively championing his gay son was not something the culture had seen before, but the private reality was more layered. Magic Johnson grew up in a working-class black household in Michigan in the 1960s and 1970s. He played professional basketball in locker rooms where the word gay was never used neutrally. The journey to the place where he could stand beside E.J. with genuine pride and without reservation was not instantaneous, and Magic has acknowledged that. "I had to grow," he said in one interview. "I had to educate myself. I had to examine what I believed and why I believed it." That willingness to examine himself publicly, to admit that his love for his son required him to change, is one of the most quietly significant things he has ever done. It cost him nothing in the abstract and required everything in the personal. E.J. faced his own battles. The public attention around his weight, his appearance, his sexuality, amplified enormously by his father's profile, was at times brutal. He became a television personality, appearing on reality programming that exposed him to a level of scrutiny no one should have to navigate. Magic watched it, supported it, and privately worried in the way all parents worry, but with the specific helplessness of knowing that his own fame was part of what made his son a target. For over 30 years, Magic Johnson has woken up every morning and taken medication for H.I.V. That fact tends to disappear in the broader narrative of his survival, because the survival has been so complete, so visible, so apparently uncomplicated, that it is easy to forget that it requires daily maintenance and carries a psychological weight that does not diminish with time. The antiretroviral therapy he began in the early 1990s, experimental at the time, refined and improved over subsequent decades, has suppressed the virus to the point where his viral load is now clinically undetectable. He cannot transmit the virus. He shows no symptoms. By most observable measures, he is a healthy 66-year-old man. But the medication has side effects that accumulate over decades. The psychological dimension of managing a chronic illness, the awareness that missing a dose has consequences, that his immune system requires monitoring that most people will never think about, that the disease that defined the public narrative of his life is still present in his body every single day, does not simply fade because the medication is effective. He has spoken about what it means to live under the weight of a label that was attached to him at 32 and has never been removed. He is not simply Magic Johnson, basketball legend. He is, in the public understanding, Magic Johnson, who has HIV. The diagnosis arrived before the internet made everything permanent, and yet it has remained more permanently attached to his identity than almost anything he has achieved since. There is a specific loneliness in being a symbol. People project onto you what they need you to represent: hope, resilience, survival. And in doing so, they replace the actual person with the version of him they require. Magic Johnson, the symbol, has been extraordinarily useful to millions of people. Magic Johnson, the man, has sometimes had to disappear inside that symbol and stay there, performing certainty he did not always feel. He has described moments, in private conversations that eventually became public, of sitting alone and wondering whether the life he was living, the appearances, the advocacy, the constant visibility, was for him or for the narrative the world had constructed around him. Whether Irvin Johnson and Magic Johnson had become two entirely different people, and whether there was still space, at his level of fame and with his particular history, for the private one to exist. At 66, Irvin Johnson does not move through the world the way he once did. The Showtime fast break is gone. The knee that absorbed thousands of cuts and drives over 15 professional seasons announces itself every morning. The medication he takes for HIV, the same medication that has kept the virus undetectable for decades, remains a daily ritual, a quiet reminder that the body requires management that most men his age never think about. He wears reading glasses now. He chooses his appearances with more deliberation than he once did. He is, by any honest measure, a man who has spent his reserves, physical, emotional, psychological, and knows it. And yet, the business empire keeps growing. Magic Johnson Enterprises continues to expand. His stake in the Los Angeles Dodgers has appreciated dramatically. The foundations he built in underserved communities have generated wealth and employment in neighborhoods that the mainstream economy spent decades treating as write-offs. His net worth is estimated at over $1 billion. A figure that would mean nothing to him, he has said repeatedly, if it were not connected to something beyond accumulation. He is still married to Cookie, 34 years since a diagnosis that should have ended them. She still stands beside him at events, still speaks about their marriage with the directness of someone who earned the right to define it on her own terms. EJ is thriving. Their daughter Elisa, whom they adopted, has built her own life. The family that was assembled under conditions of crisis has, against considerable odds, held together. But here is the truth that the triumphant framing of his story tends to obscure. Magic Johnson did not beat HIV. He manages it every day with medication that was not available to the thousands of people who died from AIDS in the years before effective antiretroviral therapy existed. His survival is real, and it is also, in part, a consequence of timing and resources that most people with the same diagnosis in 1991 did not have access to. He has been honest about this. He has used his platform to say it plainly. I am alive because I could afford the best medical care in the world. Everyone with HIV deserves the same chance. He did not get to finish his basketball career. He never played a full season after the age of 32. The championships he might have won, and the 1990s Lakers, by any reasonable projection, had the pieces to compete, exist only as speculation. The final years of his prime were spent in retirement, in advocacy, in television appearances, in a public role that required him to perform resilience on behalf of an entire community, while privately figuring out how to be a father, a husband, and a man living with a disease that the world had not yet learned to stop treating as a verdict. He has described fatherhood, particularly his relationship with E.J., as the most significant education of his life. Not basketball, not business. The slow, humbling work of loving a child well, of recognizing where his assumptions were wrong and changing them, of learning that the version of strength he had been raised to perform was not always the version his family needed from him. That is where the real story of Magic Johnson lives. Not in the championships, or the billion-dollar portfolio, or the 30-year survival. Though all of those are extraordinary, it lives in the gap between the symbol and the man, in the distance between what the world required him to be and what it actually cost him to be it, in the quiet persistence of a marriage rebuilt from damage, in the growth of a father who had to unlearn things he had never thought to question. He is still standing, still smiling, still filling every room he enters. But if you look closely, past the legend, past the symbol, past the resume, what you find is something more valuable than any of it. A man who was broken more than once, in more ways than the public ever fully saw, and who chose, every single time, to keep going. Not because it was easy, because E.J. was watching, because Cookie was still there, because somewhere, someone who had just received a diagnosis they were too terrified to speak out loud needed to see that survival was possible. That, more than any championship, is the legacy Irvin Johnson will leave behind. What part of Magic Johnson's story changed the way you see him? Leave your thoughts below and subscribe for more untold chapters behind the legends.